had this YouTube channel for quite some time, but I started to post regular videos about a year ago, a little bit more than a year actually, and I've since then published around 85 videos. Now naturally, as these things go, a couple of errors happened and a couple of mistakes were made. A couple of times I was a little bit misguided, so I felt it is time to talk about those things, talk about the things where I was wrong and you guys were right, and this is what we're going to do today. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I teach at the Antoinette Westphal College at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. And if any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join my Discord community. An invite link is in the description below. And please also don't forget to press the like button because the YouTube algorithm really asks for it. Now, with that being said, let's get right to the first mistake I made. The first area I want to talk about happened in a video where I compared the internal Dolby Atmos renderer that comes with Nuendo with the external Dolby Atmos renderer. Now I made this video primarily because I got so many requests on how to create a binaural down mix in Dolby Atmos, and around that time the internal Dolby Atmos renderer in Nuendo did not yet have the binaural down mix option. So there were really only two ways how you can create a binaural down mix. Either you created a setup within Nuendo and used an external binaural down mix plugin, or you went through the external renderer. And this was the motivation for me to kind of look into what the external Dolby Atmos renderer is capable of and how it actually works. Now, unfortunately, as all of you know, or most of you at least know, the external Dolby Atmos renderer only works on a Mac, so you actually need a Mac to do that. And I hadn't actually used a Mac, at least in the video setup that I'm using here, for quite some time. But I nevertheless decided to get my Mac up to speed and download the external renderer and play around with it a little. Now, unfortunately, and that is something that really puzzled me, the results that came out of the internal Dolby Atmos renderer and the results that came out of the external Dolby Atmos renderer were completely different. They didn't even sound the same, and that really kind of threw me off quite a bit. Now, as we now know, and I actually created a follow-up video on that, this was primarily the result of a bug in Nuendo. Nuendo, unfortunately, around the time had a bug where the export would not export certain parameters unless you had an automation line. And in this particular example that I used, I changed the size of the objects, of the Atmos objects, and this size information, because it was not stored in an automation lane, was not exported correctly. So the external renderer that we used in order to play back that Dolby Atmos master file had the wrong information about the size of the objects, and therefore these two files sounded completely different on the internal renderer and on the external renderer. Now, this wasn't really the mistake that I made. The mistake was rather a result of that bug, because the audio file sounded completely differently in the internal renderer as opposed to the external renderer. I hadn't actually noticed that I also set the output settings in the external renderer incorrectly. I used to actually monitor the stereo output and not the headphone output. In the external renderer, you actually need to switch that into stereo only mode. Now, this was pointed out by a user in the comments, user IAM. Thank you very much. And this was actually my very first mistake that I ever made in my videos. That's something that I, I'm a little bit humbled, but as you know, kind of these things happen, and kind of that's the way it is. I ended up deciding to create a follow-up video where I set everything straight. So if you watch that video, you make sure that you also watch the follow-up video where I kind of walk back all the errors that I made in this particular video. But once again, one of my most popular videos, but also one of my most flawed videos. Mistake number 2 happened in the video series about how to use Audio Kinetic Wise in connection with the Unity game engine, and more specifically in the video where I showed you how to use footstep sounds, or how to create footstep sounds with Audio Kinetic Wise. Now, I had done footstep sounds before and actually done videos about footstep sounds before, but for this particular video, what I decided to do is I decided to switch the first-person controller to a new controller that Unity had just released around that time. And in order to make it work, I needed to actually rewrite some of the code that I usually use. And in writing that code, I made an error that turned out to be actually a critical error, probably the most critical error that I ever made in this entire series of videos that I did. Now, this error was pointed out by user Gabriel Gabriel Miller, it actually took quite some time until somebody actually found that error. And I wasn't quite sure if it is an error at first, but once you actually understand what the problem is, it becomes fairly obvious that I made a big boo-boo. What essentially had happened is that I used the time.delta time parameter incorrectly in one of the function calls that I used in order to measure the time from one footstep to the next. Now, in case you don't know, time.delta time measures the time in milliseconds from one frame to the next. And that is a parameter that is very important in order to make sure that you write your scripts in such a way that anything that you do in your game is independent from the power of your computer where you're running your game, so that if you have a very, very powerful computer that kind of is able to essentially kind of put out a lot of frames per second, the experience is the same as if you would be on a computer that essentially is not capable of putting out as many frames per second. So for that, you have that parameter that essentially measures the time it takes from one frame to the next, and you can use that in order to kind of get your timing correctly. Now, in this particular case, unfortunately, it was not necessary to actually kind of scale that with that particular parameter. In the way I actually wrote that script, that time difference between frames was already accounted for, and by multiplying it with that delta time parameter, I actually counted that effect twice. And the result was that if you would play that game, or if you would create that game in your Unity editor, it would actually work perfectly. And as soon as you would compile it and run it in the compiled version, it would actually kind of be way too fast. So the footsteps would come way too fast. And that is very unfortunate. It is probably once again, the most serious error that I ever made. And once again, thank you for Gabriel Miller for pointing that out. It is actually fairly difficult to spot, but it shows you that never trust anybody who is talking on YouTube. Always make sure that you have your critical mind turned on and that you think about everything that you see in a critical way, because, kind of people make mistakes. And in this case, I was the one who made the mistake. Mistake number 3 isn't really a mistake. It's more of a misconception, or maybe something that I put too much emphasis on and that ended up not really being that important, or at least not as important as I thought it is. And it happened in my review of the Hornet SAMP plugin. Now, if you are not familiar with Hornet SAMP, it is a plugin that allows you to do something like a mixing bus in a Dolby Atmos project. And the way it does it is by giving you one plugin where you control the settings for all the individual Dolby Atmos objects simultaneously. So it allows you to essentially set the compression settings and the EQ settings, and it gives you some sort of an option of having something like a mastering bus, really. That's what it is. Now, I really liked that plugin, and I gave it a fairly positive review. Around the time it had a couple of bugs, but nothing really critical. However, one thing that I pointed out is that it would have been nice to also be able to include the Dolby Atmos bed in that particular plugin, because around that time it was only able to take in the objects. It could only work with stereo tracks, and it couldn't really work with beds. So you only were able to use that in connection with the Dolby Atmos object. And I thought it would be nice to also be able to have the same approach to the bed, or kind of to bring the bed into the plugin. Now, the problem with that is that if you have a surround bed, you need to think about compression differently. And the reason for that is that in a traditional surround environment, in a traditional surround sound, you have most of the action happening in the front channels. And the back channels or the surround channels are really only there in order to kind of give you some additional effects. So the volume that you have in your surround speakers is much, much lower than the volume that you have in your main speakers. And my feeling was that if you now apply compression, then that would essentially mean that you would bring up the volume in the surround channels, and you would essentially kind of scale down the volume in the main channels, and that would be detrimental to your stereo impression, because you would now kind of move everything to the back. Now, this is to some extent true. I haven't really seen many people talk about it. However, there are people who kind of in that particular, who are active in that particular field, who essentially tell you that you should use compression very, very lightly if you're working with surround. And my impression is that it's primarily because of exactly what I just said. And the other thing is that many of the compressors that are designed to particularly work for surround productions actually differentiate between the stereo pairs that you have in a surround setup. So they allow you to actually set the compression settings differently for the surround speakers as opposed to the main speakers. And so I felt very comfortable that my impression was correct, and my understanding understanding of the topic was correct. And I even had a chat with the developers of Hornet where I pointed that out, where you need to kind of be careful about how you do compression. Now, the thing though is that I might have overestimated that effect. And that is primarily for two reasons. First of all, Dolby Atmos is slightly different than traditional surround. In traditional surround, there is a strong emphasis on the front speakers, and once again, the back speakers are only there to augment what is happening in the front speakers. In Dolby Atmos, all the speakers are really equal. So they have equal importance. You're also using the same physical speakers for all channels, which you normally don't do in a traditional surround setup. And this differentiation between the surround speakers and the front speakers is not as strong as you would normally have. All the speakers are essentially play the same role, and therefore kind of compressing them, it might make some changes in the way the objects are located, but it's probably not going to be enough to even worry about, quite frankly. And the second thing is that for most of us are really interested, or most of people who are watching this channel are really interested in Dolby Atmos music production. And in Dolby Atmos music production, quite frankly, it doesn't make any difference whatsoever, because you are using that as an effect, and an effect can mean different things. And if it changes the stereo or the three-dimensional impression of that, so what? Maybe that's exactly what you wanted. Maybe this is actually a good thing. Maybe it's something that allows you, like, for example, if you're working with mid-side kind of algorithms that kind of working with the mid channel differently than with the side channel, and you could technically use that as an effect here as well. So in music production in particular, it's probably not going to make any difference. So in contrast to what I said back then, my feeling now is that this is probably not going to make a whole lot of a difference. So you could just kind of take that bad channel and put it into Hornet SAMP, and it would probably just work perfectly fine for pretty much anything that we do around here. I'm still fairly certain that what I said is not incorrect, but it's just not really that important. Mistake number 4 has to do with the way I used Spacelab Ignition in order to add a reverb to a Dolby Atmos project. And this is also a fairly popular one. For some reason, all the mistakes that I make are in popular videos. I'm not quite sure why that is. Bit unfortunate, but hey, what can I do? And in this particular case, I would still argue that it's not really a mistake as such. It's just kind of the way I approached things were not entirely appropriate, let's put it that way. And I need to explain a little in terms of my background and where I come from. If I think about reverb, the way I think about it is in terms of a game engine, right? So if you are playing a game and you are kind of entering a room and then you have a reverb, and in games, particularly newer games, it is really important that you get an impression that is as realistic as possible. And that means that the reverb needs to also react to the position of the sound object within that particular space. And that means that if you're moving the sound object around, the reverb will generally change. So that's usually what you do in a game engine or in a virtual reality environment, really. So with that in mind, I approached kind of the question on how to add a reverb to a Dolby Atmos setting. And so my complete conviction was to make sure that the reverb is true to the position of the sound in that particular space. Now, as it turns out, in Spacelab, the reverb is actually also agnostic to the position of the sound. So it doesn't actually make any difference where you position that sound. And that essentially means the use of Spacelab as such is kind of questionable. I mean, it still makes sense. There are some reasons why you might want to do that, but it doesn't really give you the benefit that I originally thought it would. It doesn't really change much in terms of the reverb. We could just take a regular reverb. And that was pointed out by one of the commenters that who essentially said, why are you doing things that complicated? Just put a reverb on there and you're done with it. And back then I thought, well, I want to make sure that kind of the position is taken into account correctly and the reverb is done correctly. And unfortunately, especially with Spacelab Ignition, that was a little bit misguided. Now, I did later videos where I used DAVR Pro and also one video in Ableton where I used an Ambisonics reverb. And in these particular cases, the position of the sound source is actually influencing the reverb, or the reflections more accurately. But in spatial recognition, it is not. So if you're watching that video and you're wondering why are you using spatial recognition, where you could simply just plop a reverb on there, and I now have to honestly say that is completely correct. In this particular video, the use of spatial recognition is probably a little bit overkill. Now, having said that, it might very well be that in the future, spatial recognition is adding a possibility to add reflections to the reverb, and in that particular case, you would actually hear a difference depending on the position of the sound source. But the last time I checked, at least, this was not the case, and the reverb is just completely agnostic to where the position of that sound source really is. Error number 5, and the last one, is actually a fairly recent one, and that also happened in a video that turns out to be fairly popular. I don't know why this is the case. Maybe people like to view my errors, I don't know, and kind of watch me make mistakes. I'm not completely sure. Anyway, it happened in the video where I talked about halo vision, and it was actually pointed out immediately after I published that video. One of the first comments was that halo vision and Nuendo actually don't work together particularly well. And that is because the channel order that Halo Vision reports is different to what Nuendo expects. You can actually see that in that video, and that is essentially, if you look at the frequency haze and the location haze, you will actually see that you have some action on the back speakers where there shouldn't actually be any action because the signal is in front. Now, when I originally kind of created this video, I saw that and I felt that is weird. But kind of my experience with Nuendo, in particular with the way Nuendo handles positioning of sounds in three-dimensional spaces, is such that I probably felt that this is probably an issue with Nuendo. It probably does something that it shouldn't do, and I didn't think too much about it. But as it actually turns out, is that Halo Vision reports that incorrectly. So the back speakers are actually not the back speakers; they're actually kind of the speakers that are on the side. So if you want to use Halo Vision correctly, what you would have to do is you would have to put that into a wrapper, into a plug bidule, for example, and then kind of move things around to make sure that the channels are reported correctly, which makes this plugin even less attractive because you can't simply plug it into Nuendo. You have to actually kind of plug it into Bidule and then kind of make a couple of changes to the routing and then essentially plug everything in Nuendo. So that is actually another thing that kind of is a little bit annoying about that particular plugin. Now, the reason I didn't think too much about it is, quite frankly, is because I had some experience with some other plugins from NewGen, from the Halo series, Halo Up Mix and Halo Down Mix, and these plugins seem to, at least the way I experienced them, seem to work perfectly fine with Nuendo. So I didn't really expect that to be different for that particular plugin. So the fact that this plugin reports it incorrectly, some people have pointed out that is a bug, either in Nuendo or in Halo Vision. But it is at least interesting that sort of that plugin does certain things differently in Nuendo than some of the other plugins from NewGen. So this is really everything I wanted to say today. What do we learn from that? Well, we essentially learn that people like me who have YouTube channels can make mistakes. So if you're watching videos, make sure that you keep your critical thinking head on and you always look closely at what everybody's doing and question everything, really. That's the main thing. That's what I tell my students also. And with that being said, see you at the next video.